Coca-Cola once ran the largest taste test in corporate history and still got it completely wrong. By the early 1980s, Coca-Cola was under real pressure. Pepsi had spent years running blind taste comparisons in stores and malls, and in those comparisons, tasters kept choosing Pepsi over Coke. Coca-Cola's market share edge was shrinking for the first time in decades. Executives inside the company were not reacting to a feeling. They were reacting to a competitor that had built its entire marketing campaign around beating them in a cup. That pressure matters, because it explains why smart, experienced executives were so ready to trust a single number. When a competitor is winning in public, in stores, in front of customers, the instinct is to find a number that answers back, decisively, in the other direction. That instinct isn't irrational, it's just incomplete. And incomplete instincts dressed up as rigorous research are exactly how confident companies make their biggest mistakes. So Coca-Cola decided to fight back with research of its own, on a scale nobody had attempted before. In 1985, the company changed its secret formula. That decision wasn't a guess. It was backed by one of the biggest market research efforts any company had ever run. Coca-Cola conducted 200,000 taste tests before making a move. 200,000. Not a focus group, not a hunch from an executive with a strong opinion. An enormous, statistically serious effort to find out what people actually wanted in their mouths. The tests were blind. Consumers didn't know which cup held which cola. They tasted the new, sweeter formula against original Coke. They tasted it against Pepsi. Over and over, in market after market, the new formula won. It beat old Coke. It beat Pepsi. By every number on the page, this was not a close call. It was a landslide, repeated across a sample size most researchers would consider bulletproof. Put yourself in the room where that data got presented. You have 200,000 data points. You have consistent, repeated wins against your biggest rival and against your own flagship product. Any manager looking at that spreadsheet would say the same thing. Ship it. Coca-Cola did exactly that. The company discontinued the original formula entirely and launched New Coke nationwide, confident it had just made the most research-validated decision in its history. Then the public did something the spreadsheet never predicted. The backlash was immediate. It was furious. Angry phone calls flooded Coca-Cola's headquarters, sometimes 6,000 calls a day. 6,000 people, every day, calling a soft drink company to complain about a drink. Protest groups formed, organizing around the idea that something had been taken from them without a vote. People started hoarding cases of the original formula, buying it up and storing it in garages like it was about to be taken from them personally, which, in a sense, it already had been. This wasn't a marketing complaint. This was grief, expressed through phone calls and hoarded inventory. People were reacting the way you react when something familiar disappears without warning, not the way you react to a product update. Some of the loudest voices weren't even regular Coke drinkers. They were people defending a symbol, not a beverage, which is exactly the signal a taste test could never have picked up in a 5-second sip. Within 79 days, Coca-Cola reversed course completely and brought the original recipe back, rebranded as Coca-Cola Classic. 79 days between one of the most confident, research-backed product launches in corporate history and one of the fastest public reversals a major company has ever executed. Think about the internal whiplash that represents. This was not a company slowly adjusting a strategy over a fiscal year. This was a company watching its own customers, in real time, reject a decision that 200,000 data points had said was correct. Here's the part worth sitting with. The taste tests weren't wrong. That's the detail almost everyone leaves out when they retell this story as a simple failure. People genuinely did prefer the sweeter taste, in a blind, quick sip. The data was accurate, the methodology wasn't broken, and the sample size wasn't too small. Coca-Cola didn't get bad numbers. It got real, honest, well-collected numbers that told the truth about one very specific thing, and then the company treated that one thing as if it were the whole picture. A taste test measures a 5-second reaction. That's it. That's all it was ever built to measure. It cannot measure a relationship built over decades. It cannot measure nostalgia. It cannot measure identity, or the sense of ownership people feel toward a brand they grew up drinking at family dinners, at ball games, on hot summer days as kids. Coca-Cola had accidentally measured the wrong thing entirely. It tested the product. It never tested the meaning people had attached to the product, and those turned out to be two completely different questions wearing the same lab coat. Think about what a brand like that actually becomes for a long-time customer. It stops being a beverage choice made fresh each time. It becomes a small, fixed point in someone's personal history, tied to specific memories the person never consciously chose to form. You cannot survey your way into finding that attachment, because the customer usually can't articulate it either. Nobody sits down and says, "I feel ownership over this brand" on a form. It only shows up when the thing is threatened, which is precisely why Coca-Cola never saw it coming until the phone started ringing. That distinction is the whole lesson here, and it's easy to miss because it doesn't feel like a research failure from the inside. It feels like a research success that happened to produce the wrong outcome. Nobody at Coca-Cola lied about the numbers. Nobody fudged the sample size or cherry-picked the markets. The study was rigorous by any conventional standard used at the time, and it still led the company off a cliff, because rigor was never the actual problem. Scope was the problem, and scope is much harder to notice than sloppiness. Here's the part nobody expects. The bigger and more rigorous a study is, the more dangerous it can become if it's answering the wrong question. A small, sloppy study gets dismissed easily by anyone in the room. Nobody bets the company on a survey of 40 people, but 200,000 taste tests? That number creates its own gravity. It feels too large to argue with. It starts to feel like certainty itself, rather than evidence about one narrow slice of behavior. And that false sense of certainty is exactly what let Coca-Cola skip the harder question, the one that actually mattered, not which drink tastes better in a 5-second sip, but what this brand meant to the people who had been drinking it their entire lives. This is not just a soft drink story from 40 years ago. It's a research design problem that shows up constantly in modern management, usually in smaller, quieter, far less dramatic ways that never make the news and never get written up as a case study. Take a company running an A/B test on a new website design. The test changes a button, a layout, a checkout flow, and measures which version performs better. The metric is clicks. The new version gets more clicks, so the team ships it. But clicks are a 5-second reaction too. They measure whether something looks appealing in the instant a user sees it on screen. They don't measure whether the redesign quietly damages the sense of trust a returning customer has built with the brand over years of visits. A flashier layout can win the click test decisively and still push long-term customers away, because trust isn't a 5-second decision either. It accumulates the same slow way brand loyalty does, and it can be mismeasured in exactly the same way. Take a customer survey asking people what they would prefer going forward. Stated preference research is everywhere in management, in surveys, focus groups, and interviews where you simply ask people what they want. The problem is that what people say they want in a survey room and what they actually do with their wallet later are frequently two different things. People will tell a researcher they want healthier options, more sustainable packaging, or simpler pricing. Then they go to the store and buy the exact same product they always bought, for reasons the survey never asked about at all. Things like habit, convenience, price anchoring, or a loyalty they couldn't fully explain if you asked them directly. A survey measures a stated intention. It doesn't measure behavior. Treating the two as identical is the same mistake Coca-Cola made, just wearing a different outfit and running on a smaller budget. Take a customer satisfaction score, the kind almost every company tracks obsessively on a dashboard somewhere. It's a genuinely useful number. It tells you how someone felt about a single interaction, right after that interaction happened. But a high satisfaction score on individual transactions can sit right next to declining brand loyalty, because loyalty isn't built transaction by transaction. It's built over years of accumulated experience, identity, and trust that a single survey question was never designed to capture. A company can post great satisfaction scores every single quarter while slowly losing the emotional hold it has on its customer base, and the dashboard will never flag it because the dashboard was never built to measure that particular thing. One more, because managers hit this constantly and rarely name it. Take an employee engagement survey, run every year, scored and benchmarked against other companies. Scores can look healthy for years while actual retention quietly erodes underneath them, because a survey captures how someone feels answering questions in the moment, not whether they've already started interviewing elsewhere for reasons they'd never write down on a company form. In every one of these 4 cases, notice how reasonable the original decision looked at the time. Nobody chose the wrong metric out of laziness. Clicks are genuinely easy to measure and genuinely correlated with revenue in the short run. Stated preference is genuinely useful for understanding how people think about a category. Satisfaction scores genuinely predict whether a customer will complain today. Engagement scores genuinely track morale in the moment they're taken. None of these metrics are bad metrics. They're just partial ones, mistaken for complete ones, the exact same substitution that sank New Coke. Notice the pattern across every one of these examples. In each case, the data isn't fake and it isn't wrong. It's just narrow. It answers a real, specific question extremely well, and then gets used by decision makers to answer a completely different, bigger question it was never designed to touch. That substitution is invisible from inside the spreadsheet. It only becomes visible after the wrong decision has already shipped, and customers, or employees, are the ones telling you about it loudly, the way they told Coca-Cola in 1985. Here's a perspective worth adding to a case study everyone already thinks they know. The real failure at Coca-Cola probably wasn't the research team at all. It was everyone above them in the approval chain who saw a number that large and stopped asking what it didn't cover. That's a leadership failure wearing a data failure's clothes, and it's far more common than most managers want to admit, because questioning a 200,000-person study out loud in a meeting feels almost disrespectful to the effort that produced it. That reluctance to push back on big numbers is worth naming directly, because it's a social dynamic as much as a research one. Junior analysts rarely challenge a study that took months and a large budget to run. Executives rarely want to be the person in the room who asks, "But what didn't we test?" especially after everyone else has already nodded along. The result is a kind of quiet, collective agreement to stop questioning, exactly at the moment a decision is about to become permanent. The bigger the study, the more social pressure there is to simply trust it, which is the opposite of what should happen. So what does a manager actually do with this? Before trusting a data-backed decision, especially a big, expensive, hard-to-reverse one, the uncomfortable but important lesson is this. A number can be completely accurate and still measure the wrong question. Accuracy and relevance are not the same property, and a study can have one, the other, both, or neither, regardless of how large its sample size is. Before you trust a data-backed decision, don't just ask whether the data is correct. Ask what the data actually captured. Then ask, just as importantly, what it never asked about at all, because that second question is almost always the one that gets skipped in the room. In practice, that means naming the gap on purpose, out loud, before the decision ships. If you're testing clicks, ask what happens to trust. If you're testing stated preference, ask what actual past behavior has looked like. If you're tracking satisfaction on individual transactions, ask what's happening to loyalty over the long run, separately, measured on its own terms, not inferred from a quarterly average. If you're reading an engagement score, ask what retention has actually done over the same period, not what the survey implies it should be doing. The goal isn't to distrust data or slow every decision down with endless caveats. The goal is to stop treating one convenient metric as a stand-in for the entire truth, just because the sample size was large enough to feel unarguable in a meeting. There's a simple habit that catches most of this before it ships. Whenever a study or a metric is presented as the reason for a decision, ask one extra question out loud in the room. What would this number look the same, whether or not the thing we actually care about was true? If clicks would look identical whether or not trust was eroding, that's the gap. If a taste test would look identical whether or not decades of identity were at stake, that's the gap. Naming that gap doesn't kill the decision. It just forces someone to go check the thing the first number couldn't see, before the company finds out about it from 6,000 angry phone calls. None of this means big studies are worthless, or that 200,000 data points should be thrown out. It means the size of a study tells you how confident you can be in the answer it gave. It tells you nothing about whether you asked the right question in the first place. And those are two separate checks a manager has to run every single time. Coca-Cola eventually turned this disaster into one of its most loyal customer moments in history. The return of Coca-Cola Classic generated more goodwill and press coverage than the company had seen in years, an outcome nobody in that boardroom could have engineered on purpose. But that recovery only happened after the company learned, the hard and public way, that a taste bud and a memory are never quite measuring the same thing. The research wasn't the failure here. Mistaking the research for the full story was. Follow for more theories that actually explain your workplace.